What does it take to sink the safest ship ever built on her very first trip out to sea? Apparently, 4 days and 1 bad night. The RMS Titanic left Belfast as the largest object human hands had ever assembled, crossed to Southampton, picked up passengers at Cherbourg and Queenstown, and pointed straight into the open North Atlantic like the ocean simply wasn't a threat anymore. That confidence wasn't just talk. A shipbuilding trade journal at the time actually described her as practically unsinkable, and the phrase stuck to her for good. Nobody was lying. They just hadn't accounted for a night like this one. I dug through the shipyard blueprints, the passenger lists, the wireless transcripts, and the official inquiries, and used advanced AI to lay out exactly how this happened, from the yard where she was built, to the ice field where she died, to the ocean floor where she was found again, but only 73 years later. The Titanic was never meant to be fast. That distinction already belonged to 2 rival ships, the Lusitania and the Mauretania, both owned by Cunard Line and both capable of crossing the Atlantic faster than anything White Star Line could put to sea. Rather than compete on speed, White Star's chairman J. Bruce Ismay met with Lord Peary, chairman of the Belfast shipbuilder Harland and Wolff, and the two settled on a different strategy entirely. If White Star could not win the race, it would win the room. 3 sister ships were planned, named Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic, built not for speed, but for scale and comfort. Floating hotels that made the week-long crossing feel shorter than it was. Behind the plan sat one of the wealthiest men alive, the American financier J.P. Morgan, whose shipping trust, International Mercantile Marine, controlled White Star Line outright. With Morgan's capital and Peary's shipyard, the project had everything it needed except a hull. That would take 4 more years to build. Before a single plate of the Titanic could be laid, Harland and Wolff had to demolish 3 of its own slipways and build 2 new ones, the largest the yard had ever attempted, just to fit her. Spanning both was the Errol Gantry, a steel scaffold built by the Scottish firm behind the Forth Bridge and Tower Bridge, standing 228 feet high, 270 feet wide, and 840 feet long, taller than Westminster Abbey, and framed from more than 6,000 tons of steel in its own right. 10 traveling cranes ran along its length, and a separate 200-ton floating crane, shipped over from Germany, handled the boilers and machinery too heavy for anything else in the yard. Construction on the Titanic's keel began on March 31, 1909, in the slipway next to her sister ship Olympic, whose own keel had gone down several months earlier, and for the next 2 years her frame rose inside that gantry, plate by riveted plate. Building her alongside Olympic also let Harland and Wolff test a fix on one ship and carry the lesson straight to the other, cutting the typical 3-year-plus build for a ship this size down to under 2 years, keel to launch. Roughly 2,000 individual steel plates went into her hull, some stretching up to 36 feet long, the largest weighing 4.5 tons apiece, rolled at steelworks in Scotland before the gantry's cranes swung them into place. Fixing them took an estimated 3 million rivets, and the method changed depending on where they went. Machines could drive rivets into the flatter midsection of the hull with steady, even pressure, roughly 500,000 into the double bottom alone. But the sharply curved plating at the bow and stern couldn't fit a machine at all, so those sections were finished by hand, in 4-man crews that could manage around 200 rivets on a good day, a boy running rivets straight from the furnace while they still glowed, a holder-up bracing the head from inside the hull, and 2 hammermen driving it home from outside before the metal cooled. It was repetitive, dangerous work carried out at height in the cold over and over for 2 years straight. Some of the largest components arrived from outside the yard entirely. The stern frame, roughly 70 tons and more than 68 feet tall, was cast at the Darlington Forge Company in County Durham, England, then shipped north to Belfast to be fitted into the rest of the hull. Running beneath the whole structure was a cellular double bottom, a separate inner skin of steel that added rigidity and doubled as ballast space, distinct from the 16 transverse compartments above it that would later prove too shallow to save her. The design itself belonged to Thomas Andrews, the shipyard's chief naval architect and a nephew of Lord Pirrie, a man who reportedly knew the position of every pipe and stairwell in the ship before she was even finished. Roughly 15,000 men worked the yard at the height of construction, though only around 3,000 of them, about a fifth of the workforce, were assigned to Titanic at any given time, since Olympic and the third sister ship, Britannic, were rising in the same yard alongside her. Safety was rudimentary by modern standards. 246 injuries were recorded over the build, 28 of them severe, and 8 workers died. On May 31, 1911, more than 100,000 spectators lined the Belfast waterfront to watch her launch, an empty steel hull sliding down 22 tons of soap and tallow into the water in barely over a minute. What always strikes me here is that the ship the crowd cheered for that day had no engines, no funnels, and not a single cabin. She was still, in every meaningful sense, hollow. Launching the hull was only half the job. For nearly a year afterward, the Titanic sat at Harland and Wolff's outfitting wharf, while workers turned an empty shell into the most opulent ship afloat. Below decks, engineers installed 29 boilers and 159 coal-fired furnaces to drive 2 enormous reciprocating steam engines and a central low-pressure turbine, a combination that turned 3 separate propellers and gave her a designed cruising speed of around 21 knots. That machinery fed 4 towering funnels. Although only 3 actually vented smoke, the 4th added for ventilation, and, just as importantly, for the symmetry of her silhouette, since White Star's advertising team understood that a 4th funnel simply looked more impressive on a poster. Above the machinery, workers built the famous grand staircase beneath a dome of wrought iron and glass, along with a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths, a squash court, and a gymnasium fitted with mechanical rowing machines and electric horses, amenities almost no ocean liner of the period offered. A one-way ticket for the most expensive first-class parlor suites ran to roughly £870, the modern equivalent of well over $100,000, while a third-class berth cost only a small fraction of that, reflecting just how sharply the ship's luxury was stratified from top deck to bottom. When finished, she measured 882 feet 9 inches long and weighed in at just over 46,000 gross register tons, making her the largest man-made moving object in the world. Her hull was divided into 16 watertight compartments, sealed by doors that could be triggered electronically from the bridge, and a trade publication of the day called the design practically unsinkable, a phrase that would follow her for the rest of history. And yet, for all that engineering confidence, she carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for barely half the about 3,300 people she could carry at full capacity. British Board of Trade regulations, written for ships a fraction of her size, required even fewer, and earlier proposals for additional boats were scaled back to keep her promenade decks uncluttered. That decision, not an oversight but a choice, would matter enormously in a few months' time. On April 10, 1912, the Titanic eased away from her berth in Southampton under the command of Captain Edward J. Smith, White Star's most senior officer, who intended this to be his final voyage before retirement. She had barely cleared the dock when the sheer volume of water she displaced snapped the mooring lines of the nearby liner New York, dragging its stern toward the Titanic and forcing a last-second maneuver to avoid collision, an unsettling start that some passengers later remembered as an omen. From Southampton, she crossed the Channel to Cherbourg, France, then sailed on to Queenstown, Ireland, taking on additional passengers and mail at each stop before finally turning west into open ocean. Around 2,224 people were aboard by the time she left Ireland behind. The first-class passenger list read like a roll call of the era's wealth: the property magnate John Jacob Astor IV, the mining heir Benjamin Guggenheim, and the department store owner Isidor Straus, traveling with his wife Ida. The American socialite Margaret Brown, later remembered by the nickname the unsinkable Molly Brown, was also aboard. In third class, hundreds of emigrants from Ireland, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe had booked steerage tickets chasing new lives in America, many of them families traveling with everything they owned packed into a single trunk. The ship's crew numbered roughly 885, from stokers shoveling coal in the boiler rooms to stewards serving 11-course dinners in the first-class dining saloon, and Captain Smith kept the ship running at a steady, assured pace throughout. Thomas Andrews sailed too, quietly jotting notes for small design improvements on future crossings, unaware of what was to come. For 4 days, the voyage was smooth, fast, and by every account entirely unremarkable, the kind of crossing that made passengers write home about the food and the string orchestra rather than the sea itself. That calm ended on the night of April 14th. The Titanic's wireless operators had already received at least 6 warnings that day about pack ice and icebergs directly along her route, but she kept steaming at close to her top speed of 22 knots, and not every warning reached the bridge. The sea was flat calm, and the sky was moonless, which hid the usual iceberg foam. At 11:40 p.m., lookout Frederick Fleet spotted a dark shape rising out of the water dead ahead and rang the warning bell 3 times. First Officer William Murdoch ordered the wheel hard over and the engines reversed. She very nearly swung clear. Instead, the iceberg scraped roughly 300 feet of her starboard hull below the waterline, buckling plates and popping rivets rather than tearing one large gash, and water poured into 6 of her 16 watertight compartments. Thomas Andrews ran the numbers within the hour. The design could survive 4 compartments flooded, but not 6, because the bulkhead separating them didn't extend high enough to contain the rising water. This was the test the unsinkable design had never actually faced, and it had just failed it. Wireless operators sent distress calls while crew fired rockets into the sky. A nearby ship, the Californian, was close enough to see them, but her wireless had been switched off for the night. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, was the one ship that answered, and her captain pushed her engines well past their rated output through the same ice field, reaching the site around 4 a.m., roughly 90 minutes after Titanic went under. By then, confusion and poor crew training had sent several of her 20 lifeboats away barely half full, on a ship that never carried enough boats for everyone aboard, regardless. At 2:20 a.m., her lights failed, and she slipped beneath the surface. Around 1,500 people went into water measured at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The Carpathia pulled about 705 survivors from the lifeboats and carried them into New York 3 days later, but only around 710 people made it off the Titanic alive in total. The disaster triggered formal inquiries almost immediately, one convened by the United States Senate and another by the British Board of Trade, both of which picked apart nearly every decision made that night. Investigators scrutinized the ignored ice warnings, the shortage of lifeboats, the disorganized loading process, and the silent wireless aboard the Californian. Public outrage translated quickly into new law. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, first adopted in 1914, required that every ship carry enough lifeboats for everyone aboard, mandated 24-hour wireless watch so a repeat of the Californian's silence could not happen again, and established the International Ice Patrol to track icebergs drifting south into shipping lanes, a body that still monitors the North Atlantic today using aircraft and satellite data. White Star's own sister ship, the Olympic, was pulled from service soon after and refitted with a full complement of lifeboats and a partial double hull, changes made directly in response to what investigators had found. Titanic had been sold to the public as evidence that modern engineering had conquered nature. Her sinking became the far more famous evidence that it had not, at least not yet. For 73 years, nobody knew exactly where the Titanic came to rest, until a joint American and French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel located her on September 1, 1985, roughly 2.5 miles down. What they found confirmed she'd broken in two, and the split told 2 very different engineering stories. The bow, narrower and structurally stronger, sank in a relatively straight, controlled descent, and is still recognizably a ship. The stern, wider and less rigid, imploded and twisted apart under trapped air and water pressure on the way down. And today, it's a flattened, unrecognizable mess of plating roughly a third of a mile from the bow. Decades of studying recovered steel and rivets have also answered a question the sinking left open. Metallurgists found that the wrought iron rivets used by hand at the bow and stern held roughly 3 times the slag content considered safe, making them brittle enough to snap in ice-cold water rather than bend, which is likely why her hull popped seams instead of tearing open on impact. The wreck itself is being consumed where it sits. Iron-eating bacteria, since named Halomonas titanici, digest the exposed steel into rust formations called rusticles, growing at roughly a centimeter a year, while the mix of steel, bronze, and brass throughout the hull sets up a slow electric current in the salt water that corrodes the iron even faster. Researchers now expect the ship could be entirely gone within a matter of decades. In the span of roughly 3 years, the Titanic went from a dinner table idea to the largest ship the world had ever seen to a wreck at the bottom of the Atlantic, all before she completed a single full crossing. She was, at once, a genuine triumph of early 20th century engineering and a monument to the overconfidence that came with it. And the gap between those two truths cost close to 1,500 lives in a single freezing night. Every safety rule that followed, the full lifeboats, the round-the-clock radios, the ice patrol still tracking bergs today, exists because of what was learned from that one voyage.
If this deep dive was your kind of history, hit subscribe for more full-length stories of the ships, structures, and disasters that shaped the modern world. What should I cover next? Leave it in the comments, and I will see you in the next one.